a lot of things in the same time and the same moment.
Sort of the same
A lot of things in the same time and the same moment.
From the same time, more or less at the same time, question the same things. We are facing the same problems.
Hello and welcome to the Other Minds podcast. I'm Joseph Bohikian. You're listening to Simultaneous by today's guest, Pamela Z. Other Minds, founded in 1992 in San Francisco by Charles Amerkanian and Jim Newman, is devoted to championing the most original voices in new and experimental music. On season 4 of the podcast, we're talking with a range of composers, performers, and authors across the field of new music, including the featured composers from the 29th Other Minds Festival, which will take place October 16th to 19th, 2025, at the Brava Theater in San Francisco. Pamela Z is a composer, performer, and media artist working with voice, live electronic processing, sampled sound, and video. A pioneer of live digital looping techniques, she processes her voice in real time to create dense, complex sonic layers. Her works combine experimental extended vocal techniques, operatic bel canto, found objects, text, sampled sounds, and custom MIDI controllers that allow her to manipulate sound and image with physical gestures. At this year's Other Minds Festival, Pamela Z will perform her piece Simultaneous, an intermedia composition for voice, electronic processing, chamber ensemble, speech samples, gesture control, and projected video. In conjunction with the performance, Other Minds Records will release a fixed media version of Simultaneous on LP and CD. I'm very pleased to be joined by Pamela Z today to talk about her piece. Welcome to the podcast, Pamela.
Thank you for having me.
The musicality of speech seems to really be central to Simultaneous. So what draws you to finding music in speech?
Well, I've actually had a fascination with that for a long time. And I think that a lot of composers that live in modern times discover that at some point or another because we have recording technology. It's easy to hear by taking fragments of speech and just repeating them. It's easy to hear the fundamental tone and the rhythmic patterns that are in them as soon as there's some kind of repeat. And so I think I discovered that pretty early on when I first started using digital delays and would capture my own speech in loops. And so I just have never tire of that. There's melodic material there that is just fresh with each time that someone says anything. And so it just seems like a really endless source of melodic material. So I've actually used it a lot especially in my chamber writing, not just in Simultaneous, but in other works that I've composed, commissioned works that I've composed for chamber ensembles and so forth.
And in Simultaneous, what's the relationship between those speech samples and the instruments? It seems like at times they're tracking the contour. So is there some kind of transcription of the spoken voices?
Yeah, when I compose the parts for them to play, I often am starting with transcribing the speech sounds and then writing the music based on those and inserting those. So then when they play the music, they play in sync with the text collage that I build from those speech fragments so that they are in fact playing along with the actual pitches and rhythms that are in the speech. And so it goes in and out of that. I mean, there are some places where it's just almost 100%. Every note that's being played is derived from the speech. And then there are other places where they're playing in counterpoint with the speech, or they're just playing some other kind of sound bed or something that supports the speech sound, or the speech sound is supporting them somehow. So it just is used in different ways in different different places.
Let's listen to an excerpt of the performance version of Pamela Z's Simultaneous in a live recording from the Museum of Modern Art in New York, performed by Pamela Z with oboist Kyle Bruckman, violist Charlton Lee, cellist Clara Kennedy, and percussionist Shel Nordesen.
I had a dream about a very dear friend who I don't speak to very often.
non parlo molto spesso.
He was a friend from college.
Era un compagno di college, eravamo molto amici.
Work and life and things get in the way.
Il
We
lavoro
just
e la
lost touch
vita
of it.
spesso
It wasn't
allargano le distanze e abbiamo perso i contatti e non sappiamo neanche dove vivesse.
I had this dream about him, and I don't remember my
Io non
dreams.
ricordo mai i sogni che faccio.
I had a dream. I woke up and
Quando
I
sono
realized
svegliata
that
mi sono resa
I was a
conto
baby.
che
I
il
couldn't
sogno
figure out
c'era
who
un
the child
bambino, ma io
belonged to.
non sapevo di chi fosse.
He and his
Lui
wife
e la moglie
Judy
Judy, che
didn't
conosciamo
have children.
non avevano figli.
3 days later, I got a
E
text
3
from him
giorni
saying I
dopo mi è
became a
arrivato un
father.
messaggino
3
da
days
casa
before.
sua che mi
I
diceva
had a
sono
son.
diventato padre, ho avuto un figlio maschio 3 giorni fa.
I dreamed it. It was
L'ho
real.
sognato,
I
era
have no
reale
explanation
e
for
non
how I
sono
would have known.
assolutamente in grado di spiegare come avrei potuto saperlo.
And in the live performance version, you're also manipulating the speech sounds with your gesture controllers, correct?
Well, it's there's what we like to call a tape part. So that's like fixed. And in most of the movements, not all of them, but in most of the movements, there's some kind of fixed tape part. And that part is not getting manipulated live. It's already been mixed as a text collage that plays through the sound system, but that has to be played perfectly in sync with. And there are a few places where I'm using the gesture controllers to manipulate the sample speech sounds. And there's other places where I'm actually just using the gesture controllers to manipulate processing on my voice as I sing or speak live. But most of those speech sounds that you're hearing in the live performance are fixed. And they're on a stereo mix that plays through the system. And the musicians are playing. We use a click in almost the entire piece because we're playing with a fixed media track and we need to be perfectly in time with it. So we do that.
And for those elements that you are controlling with your movement, could you talk about what those sensors are sensing and how that's translating into manipulation of the sound?
Yeah, in performance, I have 3 different controllers that I currently use pretty much in every performance. One of them uses ultrasound, and that one, it works very much like the ultrasound that you find in medical applications, where it's sending out an ultrasound tone, and then it's listening for that. And so it really works with echolocation, really, the way that the bats fly through a cave and they send that clicking sound out, and then they know when their little bat ears sense the sound returning, they know how far they are away from the cave wall, even though it's pitch black in the cave. So the ultrasound works very much the same way. It's looking for mass. And so when my hands are close to it, or when I ball my hand to make it bigger, those kinds of things will make numbers that then go to Max MSP, which is the software I use on my computer to play and control sound. And then every time I use that instrument, I do something different with how I ask the computer to interpret those numbers. So sometimes I'm making notes or triggering samples, and sometimes I'm maybe changing parameters on the processing of my voice, or any other number of events that I can trigger by sending numbers to the computer. And then I have another controller that uses infrared light, and it works kind of the similar way, except it sends out infrared and then my hand breaks that beam and sends it back to the instrument so it knows where my hand is. And then there's another gesture control instrument that I use that I wear on my hands. And that one has 3 different sensors in it. It has gyro, electromagnetometer, and accelerometer. So basically the same kinds of sensors that are in your phone. And so it can sort of sense the X, Y, and Z attitudes or movements of my hands. And all of those instruments are just essentially making numbers which get turned into MIDI values, and they become MIDI messages. And I do a lot of programming before I do a performance to make decisions about how the computer interprets those numbers and what those numbers are doing in any given piece or segment of a piece.
And I'm curious, because you work with these sensors across many different projects, if you've established movements or motions that you know work really well and have sort of become your stock set of motions, and the thing that changes is how those numbers are being translated into sound, or whether each project has its own set of motions that are unique to it.
Well, it's kind of a combination of both. I think if you would just liken it to playing an acoustic instrument, like the piano, you develop a set of gestures that you know will tease the sounds out of that instrument that you need. So it's the same with these instruments. They're really just physically played instruments, and you learn over time in playing them what gestures work the best for doing which kinds of things. And so it partially depends on how I'm trying to use the instrument in that particular instance, and also just a vocabulary of gestures that I've developed over time that work well with those instruments. So there's things like, there are places where if I just want to move my hands up and down to get further away or closer to the sensors, I can use that in kind of a potentiometer way, like making a fader out of it, like it's a fader in the air. Or if I want to maybe trigger some samples very fast, lots of them, then I might turn my hand on the side and start to wriggle my fingers so that I'm getting quick gestures that the machine is sensing. So it's very much, again, I'm comparing it to acoustic instruments. If you see a concert pianist and they play part of a piece that involves very repetitive playing of a single note, a really good pianist, you'll notice, doesn't play those single notes with the same finger over and over again. They actually run through all of their fingers. By doing so, they can get more nuance in each attack having its own sort of feel or sound, but also they can more effectively hit that key repeatedly very quickly and smoothly, which would be harder to do with just one finger hammering away at that key. So there's a lot of techniques that are sort of akin to that are involved when you use these gesture-controlled instruments. Whether that differs from piece to piece in terms of the techniques that I'm using also depends on what I'm trying to do in each of those pieces. And so it's a combination of using the gestures that do certain things best and of programming and saying, well, in this piece, what I really want is to change the parameters. Maybe I'm capturing a sample of my voice live, and then I'm manipulating by granulating whatever that sound is that's in the buffer. So I need a gesture that can move me back and forth from the front of the sample to the back of the sample, and a gesture that can help me change the size of the grains if I'm doing this granulation, or make a decision about what part of the sample I'm playing. So all of those things are done with a combination of figuring out the gestures and also writing the presets so that the computer knows what it's supposed to do with that information when it gets those numbers.
I got distracted. Profoundly distracted. It's very hard to concentrate to the point of profound distraction.
I don't
I think
think that's happened
Well, I said, within,
But within.
I don't know.
with all of that, with all of that.
I don't know. I don't know.
I don't know.
In Simultaneous, we hear many people's voices. Whose voices are we hearing? And I'm curious, what did you ask them to prompt them to get these responses?
Okay. So I did a lot of interviews, as I often do when I make this kind of work. But for this particular piece, I was actually on a Rome Prize fellowship at the time when I started the piece. And so I interviewed all the other Rome Prize fellows who were in my cohort, and also some of the residents and some of the staff. Later, when I got back, I also interviewed a few more people and added it to the sort of library of sounds that I was using. But the majority of those voices come from Rome Prize fellows who had the Rome Prize at the same time that I did. The questions I asked them were, and again, this answer is sort of based on what piece we're talking about, because every piece that I use this method for, which is kind of a lot of pieces these days, I have many pieces that I've made where the method started with doing interviews with people and then taking fragments of those speech sounds to build the piece. In this particular piece, the questions I was asking them were concerning simultaneity. So I was asking them to tell me any stories that they have about interesting instances of synchronicity in their lives that they can remember. I was also asking them, I was talking to a lot of people who were bilingual or multilingual. And so I was sometimes asking them to tell me their answers in different languages. And sometimes I was taking stories that I'd gotten from previous interviewees and then playing them for another interviewee and asking that interviewee to translate that story for me into their language, so that I would end up with multiple copies of the same story being told in more than one language. So I did that. I also was asking them questions about layers and about spolia. So spolia is sort of a phenomenon that I learned about in Rome, and it's something that's very common in Rome. And what it has to do with is people over the years kind of stealing artifacts and embedding them into their own, for their own use. So you see a lot of this where people have taken pieces of stone from something else and then they've embedded them in headstones and grave markers, or they've taken old grave markers and then mounted them on walls, almost in a decorative way. And so you see a lot of this in Rome, and some of it is really ancient, where people have found artifacts and then they've sort of repurposed them in their own construction. I thought that was just an interesting thing that I was seeing a lot of in Rome. And in fact, in the cortile, in the courtyard of the American Academy in Rome, all of the walls around the courtyard have embedded old pieces of just fragments of like gravestones and markers. And they're all like written in these ancient texts. And they're just used in a way as like a sort of a decorative markings on the walls of the courtyard. And that's something that's very commonly seen in Rome. So I found that interesting, and I wanted to talk about this spolia and how all these things from different eras exist simultaneously layered on top of each other. So I asked questions about that. And I asked questions about, I talked about language a little bit if somebody was multilingual, and asked them if they, when they speak, do they think in their own language and then translate it? Or do they think in the language, whatever language is that they're speaking in? And, so different questions like that. And then I just ask people questions about their work and about the tools that they use to make their work and how their practice works. A lot of the questions I ask are just to get them speaking conversationally, because I really like to use pieces of speech sound that don't sound like prepared speeches, but sound instead like somebody just speaking naturally and conversationally in their own natural voice. And so I often ask questions just to get people talking and to get them comfortable and to get them forget about the microphone and just speak naturally. So there were a lot of just friendly questions about asking about their lives and about their work. I also was asking them about their daily schedule. Just recite to me how your day goes, what happens at the very beginning, and just step by step, how you go through your day. A lot of the questions I ask when I do these interviews are also to elicit people giving me lists, because I love lists. And I just find them to be so poetic and musical. So I often will ask people to just name something, list something for me. Like, list all of the, like when I did my piece Baggage Allowance, I asked all of my interviewees to list for me all the things that they put in their suitcase when they go on a trip, or things like that. So, I try to find questions that will just get them to speak naturally, but also will get them to list things for me, because I just find that a really poetic way to make music.
You mentioned translation, and you wrote in your notes for the piece that the idea of simultaneity was sparked by your fascination with simultaneous translation. So where did that fascination with simultaneous translation come from? Were you watching a lot of UN General Assembly meetings?
Well, not that, but I always sort of likened it to that. But, sometimes if you go to a conference, they have headsets that you can take and get. So oftentimes I'll be at things like when I was in Berlin just now, I was in Berlin earlier this year for several months. And this is, of course, after I made the piece, but this is just an example. If I would go to a conference, a music conference, or a festival where they then had like question and answer, talk back afterwards, oftentimes there would be these headsets that people could check out in the lobby and set it to whatever their language is. And then they would be able to listen to the answers to the questions in a language that they understand. And so whenever those things are sort of prevalent, you always get sort of a little bleed. Like if you're sitting near people, you can actually hear the different languages bleeding through. Or if you're sitting too close to the booth where the translators are. When I was in Rome, I was at a sort of an arts conference. I performed at an art museum that was in the middle of some kind of an art conference festival thing. And in that case, the translators were actually all sitting at a long table at the back of the room and just kind of quietly speaking into their individual microphones. And I just loved going near them and hearing like all of them in a row, sitting there making the translations. And then also, I listen to a lot of public radio, and often when somebody is a correspondent in some part of the world where we are not, they will start with the voice of the actual interviewee, and then they will, fade it down, but it's still in the mix. And then they'll have the translator say what that person was saying. And I always love like trying to hear the actual person, even though their voice is really potted down low, and trying to compare what they're saying to what the translator is saying and see if with my limited knowledge of the language, if it sounds like they're really saying the same thing, But I have always been really fascinated with that ability, like just the mental gymnastics that must be involved in listening in one language and simultaneously speaking in another. I really admire people who can do that because I don't think everyone has that gift, you know? And one of the people I interviewed when I was in Rome was a translator. And it happened that I was one of the other artists who was there at the same time that I was a filmmaker. And one of her films was screening at one of the art museums in town. And I went and there was a Q&A afterwards, and she's American, but of course the audience was largely Italian. And so they had an Italian translator sitting on the stage. And then the person was doing a Q&A in front of the audience after the film. And this person was sitting there and translating everything. And she would go both ways. Like she would do, like when somebody was speaking English, she would do it in Italian for the Italians. And when somebody was speaking in Italian, she would do it in English for the English speaking people. And I was just amazed at her. She even it was so cute. At one point, the artist said a curse word and she translated the curse word. And so I was so fascinated. I went up to her afterwards and I said, I'm working on this project at the American Academy, and I'm wondering if you would mind coming to my studio and letting me interview you. So I interviewed the translator. And I asked her all the questions that I had been asking everyone else. But then I also played for her some of the things that other people had said and asked her if she would translate them while she listened to them. And she did. And so I have some of the text that you'll hear in Simultaneous is this woman translating the stories that the other people most of whom are Rome Prize Fellows that I interviewed. And you'll hear them panned in one direction and her panned a little bit in the other direction, saying the same thing. And I did that with a few other people who were multilingual. I asked them to translate some of the things for me. But most of those translations that are from English to Italian are in her voice.
Work and life and things get in the way.
Il
We
lavoro
just
e la
lost touch at
vita
a certain point.
spesso
I wasn't even sure
allargano
where he
le
lived.
distanze e abbiamo perso i contatti e non sapevo neanche dove vivesse.
I had this dream about him,
L'ho
and I don't remember my
sognato e io non
dreams.
ricordo mai i sogni che faccio.
I
Ho
had a
fatto un
dream.
sogno.
I woke up and
Poi
I
mi sono
realized that I
svegliata e
had
mi sono
dreamt that
resa
there was a
conto
baby,
che
and I
nel
couldn't
sogno
figure out
c'era
who
un
the child
bambino, ma
belonged
io
to.
non sapevo di chi fosse.
He and his wife
Lui e la
Judy, who
moglie
I knew
Judy, che
well, they
conosco
don't
molto
have children.
bene, non avevano figli.
3 days later, I got a
E
text
3
from him
giorni
saying
dopo
I
mi è
became a
arrivato un
father
messaggino
3
da
days
parte
ago.
sua che mi
I
diceva:
have a
sono
son.
diventato padre, ho avuto un figlio maschio 3 giorni fa.
I dreamed it. It was
L'ho
real.
sognato,
I
era
have no
reale e
explanation for
non
how I
sono
would have known
assolutamente
that.
in grado di spiegare come avrei potuto saperlo.
Different layers, different layers, different layers.
Once you had all of the interviews recorded, what was the process of organizing the different speech fragments? Was there a kind of narrative to it?
So a lot of times when I do these pieces that involve me interviewing a lot of people, this is kind of my standard operating procedure these days. I do the interviews first, and I always make sure that the people are no one is in the same room when they're hearing, and they don't get to hear each other's interviews because I want them to answer fresh and not be thinking about what somebody else said. So I get them alone, I have them do that, and then I create in Pro Tools, and I imagine in all the other digital audio workstations that there's something similar. So whatever you work in, you probably know this, but there's a feature where they used to call it making regions in Pro Tools. Now they call it clips. So I think they're just trying to sync up with the same thing that you do when you're working in video software. But you make a little bin a little library basically of named clips or regions. And so what I do is I go through and I listen to every interview. And so this is hours of listening because these interviews, on average, I mean, sometimes people are really, the interview goes really quickly, and then those will be maybe 15, 18, 20 minutes long. But more often, people are talkative and we get into a good conversation, and the interviews can be more like 45 minutes long. So I'm listening to, you know, sometimes 30, 35 interviews. And I start with the beginning of an interview, I listen, and I begin making regions. And what I do is I just listen for things I like, mostly sound I like. And so I'm listening, sometimes I'm grabbing full sentences, but more often it's just a phrase or even a word or a syllable, sometimes even just phonemes. And very often I capture and name those little in between noises that people make when they're stalling while they're trying to think. You know, things like, hmm, you know, or people will grab a little hitch in their voice when they do a little breath or something. And even like saliva noises because they're close mic'd. And I will actually select all of those things that I hear that I like and name them. And I'm mostly basing my selections on the sound itself and if it sounds somehow musical to me or interesting to me. But language always has, it's very, very tied to its meaning. So you can't really divorce it from the meaning. So I'm also thinking about the meaning. Then I'm just selecting. I'm not composing it yet. I'm just selecting, almost like going to the fabric store and picking out notions that you want to use to build something, you know? So I'm just picking these things out and I'm naming them. And I tend to name them like the initials of the person I interviewed, followed by something that describes to me what the sound is. So it might say, JB, yes, I think so. Or CA, no. You know, whatever the person said or noise they made, I try to name it in a way that I will be able to later search on it and, you know, remember what that is. So then I end up with this library of all these sounds. And one of the things I adore is that even though these people are not in the same room at the same time, there's always, almost always, at least one or two questions where everyone says the same thing. And so I love collecting samples of a bunch of different people all saying the same word or phrase. And then I can stack those and make a chorus of that with all these different voices, even though the people were originally not in the same room. So a lot of it is all about sonically building something. And I'm choosing from these, like, they're like, I'm using them like Legos and then building something out of them, you know? But in the case of a piece like this one, it did hinge around a lot of stories because I asked people to tell me stories of things that happened to them that were sort of surprising synchronous incidents. Things where they found out that a good friend of theirs was doing exactly the same thing that they were doing at the same time, or that somebody called them right when they happened to think about that person and they hadn't thought about them in years. And then they thought about them and then that person called. You know, those kinds of stories I was looking for. And so as a result, I ended up with a lot of little narrative things, little short narrative things. And I was very attached to them and I wanted to keep them intact somehow. So in this particular piece, I did build a lot of segments around these little stories. And those kept a much more, you know, they adhered to an idea or a concept more than I sometimes do. But I also liked little fragments and little pieces of words or little pieces of speech that just had an interesting ring to them or became interestingly rhythmic when they were repeated. And so it's kind of a combination of narrative, but I would say there was not an overall arc to the whole piece. In other words, there wasn't one narrative story that was starting at the beginning of the piece and building and then coming down at the end. It was more like a melange of lots of little
Copies
narratives.
of the same book, 2 phone calls on the same night, 2 pictures of the same thing, 2 black rubber raincoats. 2 letters with the same date, 2 of the same case study, same 2 foreign countries, 2 black rubber raincoats. 2 black rubber raincoats. Two black rubber raincoats. Last time I saw you was over a year ago. How could we stay in sync and not even know? 2 phone calls at the same time, 1 busy signal, 2 pictures on the same wall, 2,000 miles away, 2 episodes, same thing, 2 rubber raincoats. 2 black rubber raincoats. Two black rubber raincoats, black rubber raincoats, 2 black rubber spy coats.
Pencil.
Pencil.
Penna.
Les crayons.
Penna. Pencils and papers and
Du papier et des crayons.
pencil.
Pencil
Una
sharpeners.
penna, un registratore.
This piece exists in a few different versions. At the festival, people will hear the live performance version with chamber ensemble, but there's also a sound installation version and a radio version, which will be released soon on Other Minds Records. Could you talk about the relationship between these different versions of Simultaneous?
The first thing I want to say about it is that I was working on this piece in Rome during my Rome Prize Fellowship year, and that year was truncated by the pandemic. So I really didn't get the full year. I only got half of that time. And my intention had been, like my proposal for the project that I was going to do in Rome was to build the piece and primarily to end up making the performance work. But early on, I started first playing with sound. And I had done a lot of the interviews fairly early on during my time there. And then I was asked by the Academy to contribute a work to their annual, they have a art exhibition called Cinque Mostre. Cinque Mostre means 5 shows. And I think it's because the first couple of years they did it, they chose 5 different artists and gave them each a show, sort of in different distinct parts of the Academy. But then it expanded to have however many they wanted to have, but they kept the name Cinque Mostre. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. But they asked me if I would like to contribute a piece to that show. And I said, well, I can make a sound work. And I thought, well, I've gotten started on all these interviews, so maybe I'll build a sound piece by collaging some things from these interviews. And then later I can use some of that in making the performance work. So I started by building this sound installation. And that was the first iteration of the piece. And it was shown on 21 speakers in the cryptoporticus of the American Academy. This is a long sort of underground hallway, tunnel, kind of arched hallway. And I had 3 rows of 7 speakers that hung the length of the cryptoporticus. And I gave each one of those speakers different voices so that when you're walking through, you would hear voices coming from all around you. So that was the first iteration of the piece. And then I thought I would go on to begin to build the performance piece, but then suddenly COVID happened and we all had to leave. So then the next iteration that came about was while I was in Europe, I met a guy from Deutschland Radio in Berlin. And he said that they wanted to commission me to make a piece that would air on their air in Berlin on Deutschland Radio. And he asked for, I think, a 45-minute piece or a half hour. I can't remember. I think it was, anyway, a piece that had a certain duration that would be aired as a sound art piece on their air. So I got back from Rome and I set to work building that piece, and I built it out of all of these interviews that I had done while I was in Rome. I also added a few more interviews. They had to be done over Zoom, and I had to ask the people if they would please record themselves on their end with as high quality of a recording as they could get, and then send me the files. Then I added those to my arsenal of speech sounds that I could use to make the piece. And I built the piece for Deutschland Radio. That ended up being a 45-minute radio piece. And it was structured in a way that was very similar to the performance that people are going to see at Other Minds. Because I forgot to say this, but while I was in Rome, I had been engaged by the Museum of Modern Art in New York. They had asked me to come to New York at the end of my residency in Rome, and they were going to give me a short residency to build the piece and present it in this newly developed sound studio that they had in a new wing of the Modern. And so I was supposed to go there and present Simultaneous at MoMA, but of course I wasn't able to because of COVID. So anyway, the curator contacted me and said, well, we'd still like to have you, and maybe we can give you a longer residency and you can build the piece and present it. So that ended up happening in 23. So in summer of 2023, I went to New York. I spent a month in residence at MoMA, and I built the performance piece, which was largely based on the structure of the radio piece that I had made for Deutschland Radio. And I actually knew I was going to only have a month to work on it when I got to MoMA. So in the months leading up to that, I sketched it out and built it, and even workshopped a version of it in San Francisco at Space 124 at Project Artaud. And then subsequently took that ensemble who I worked with there to New York, with the exception of the cellist, and I had to replace the cellist with somebody in New York. So when I did it in San Francisco, the workshop version of it, I had Kyle Bruckman playing oboe and English horn. I had Charlton Lee on viola. I had Teresa Wong on cello, and I had Shell Nordison on percussion. And then me on voice and electronics. And then I built all of the projected multi-channel video stuff. Then we went to New York, and I was able to take 3 of those musicians, but Teresa wasn't available. So I got a woman named Clara Kennedy, who was a New York cellist, and she did the work there. And so then the piece was really cemented and completed. And the really lovely thing about it is that in that iteration, I combined it with the sound installation, because they had this, it was basically in a gallery where I was able to hang all of those speakers that I had had in Rome. And so there were gallery hours where public could come through and just walk between the speakers and hear the sound installation. And then at certain appointed times, I think we did it either 3 or 4 performances, I can't remember which, we brought in some hanging screens where I projected the image, and there were chairs that were amongst the speakers where the audience would sit. And then we had a little raised stage, and we performed the performance version, but the installation kind of bled into that. So there was a connection between the two. And there are lots of passages in the performance that are passages taken directly from the multi-channel sound installation. And so, but for the performance, I mixed them to stereo, so they just come out of the mains. But there were a few places where I actually had activated all 21 of the speakers. So the audience would be sitting there and they'd hear some of these voices coming from among them instead of just from the main stereo pair of speakers. So that was really fun because I was able to combine 2 of the elements of Simultaneous into one event.
You can hear Pamela Z perform Simultaneous with Kyle Bruckman, Charlton Lee, Monica Scott, and Devesh Karamchandani at Other Minds Festival 29 on Thursday, October 16th, 2025 at the Brava Theater in San Francisco. The fixed media version of Simultaneous will be available on LP and CD at the festival, and it's available for pre-order now online at the Other Minds Bandcamp page. Thank you, Pamela, for joining me today, and thanks everyone for listening.
Thank you for having me.
This has been an episode of the Other Minds podcast, brought to you by Other Minds. Our 29th festival is October 16th to 19th, 2025 at the Brava Theater in San Francisco.